There is a kind of heat that has nothing at all to do with fire. It is the heat of a held grudge, the heat of a belief nursed so long in private that it eventually hardens into something closer to conviction than resentment. Somewhere in the lands between, past the ash and the sulphur smoke rising from a mountain that never stopped burning, there is a manor built for exactly that kind of heat. Warm light in every window, wine poured freely, music drifting through open halls, and underneath every pleasantry offered to a weary traveller who wanders in from the cold, a patience that has been waiting a very long time for someone strong enough to finally reach the thing kept chained at the bottom of it all. Tonight we're going to sink into the story of Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, one of the lands between's demigods, and perhaps its most quietly misunderstood one. Before we go down into Mount Gelmir's caldera, and past the doors of Volcano Manor, I want to ask you something simple, the way I always do. Where are you tonight, right now, as this begins? Maybe you're already sinking into the mattress, blanket pulled up, the day finally behind you. Maybe you're still catching your breath from whatever the evening demanded of you, letting your shoulders drop 1 inch at a time. Wherever you are, get comfortable. Because Rykard's story is not a loud one. It is patient and simmering and slow to reveal itself, the way the best stories about betrayal and hunger for meaning usually are. This is a story about a demigod who looked directly at the promise his mother built an entire religion around, and decided quietly and then not so quietly that he did not believe a single word of it. It's a story about exile dressed up as hospitality, about a marriage that ended in someone else's arms, and about a choice so extreme, so total, that it earned him a name meant as condemnation and worn, eventually like a crown. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let the tension leave your jaw, your shoulders, your hands, and let's begin descending into the story of Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy. Before we go any further, it helps to picture the world this story unfolds within a little more clearly. The lands between exist beneath the Erdtree, an enormous golden tree whose light governs nearly every aspect of life, death, and meaning for those who live in its shadow. Queen Marika the Eternal stands at the centre of this world's entire religious and political structure, her authority woven so completely into the fabric of everyday existence that questioning it for most inhabitants of the lands between would feel less like political dissent and more like questioning gravity itself. Her demigod children were meant to embody and extend this golden authority indefinitely, each occupying their own specific role within a family whose internal harmony was supposed to mirror and guarantee the world's own stability. Tonight, we're going to trace exactly how one of those children came to see through the golden light entirely, and what he was willing to become once he did. It is not a quick story, and it does not resolve into anything as simple as villain or hero, but it is one worth sitting with slowly and patiently, the way we sit with most things that never fully stop unsettling us, long after they're over. There is a quality to Volcano Manor's atmosphere worth setting up before we descend into the full story, since so much of what makes Rykard's tale resonate depends on understanding the specific tension between how the manor presents itself and what it actually contains. Picture warm firelight against dark stone, the smell of good wine mixing with distant sulphur on the wind, laughter drifting through halls that feel, on first impression, more like a wealthy lord's hospitable retreat than anything sinister. This is by design. Every detail of the manor's outward presentation has been carefully maintained to offer exactly this impression to weary travellers, and understanding why that careful construction exists, what it's covering for and what it's protecting, is where our story truly begins. Somewhere beneath that warmth, patient and unseen, something ancient is still waiting to be found. Keep that image with you as we descend, because everything that follows is really just the slow, careful work of uncovering it. To understand Rykard, it helps to first understand what it meant to be born into the family he was born into. Rykard is one of the demigod children of Queen Marika the Eternal, the divine ruler of the lands between and the founder of the Golden Order, the religious and political structure that governed nearly every aspect of life beneath the Erdtree. Being a child of Marika was never simply a matter of bloodline. It was a kind of inheritance that came preloaded with expectation, with destiny, with the assumption that whatever path a given child chose, it would serve the continuation of the Erdtree's grace and the Golden Order's authority over the world. It's worth pausing, before going further into Rykard's specific story, to acknowledge the sheer strangeness of being raised as a demigod at all, an experience with no equivalent human parallel to draw comparison from. Existing simultaneously as an individual with private thoughts and feelings, and as a living symbol whose every action carries theological weight for an entire civilization, creates a distinct kind of internal tension that likely shaped every one of Marika's children in ways specific to their own temperament and circumstances. For some, this tension may have resolved comfortably into genuine identification with their symbolic role. For Rykard, as his later story makes clear, that resolution never fully arrived. Rykard, according to most interpretations pieced together from item descriptions and scattered in-game testimony, was counted among the children born through Marika's line, generally understood to have descended through her union with Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, the same lineage that produced Godwyn the Golden, Morgott and Mog. This placed Rykard from birth within the innermost circle of power in the lands between, a demigod whose future was in theory already written for him. He would grow, take his place among his siblings, uphold the Erdtree's grace, and eventually stand as one of the pillars supporting his mother's golden vision for eternity. Consider too the weight of names and titles within a family like this one, where even the youngest child's eventual role carried theological as well as personal significance. Being introduced not simply as Rykard, but as a son of Marika, a demigod of the Golden Order, meant that every action he took, every relationship he formed, every doubt he privately harboured, existed always within the shadow of what that title implied about his responsibilities to the broader world. This is a considerable burden to place on any child, and it's worth imagining what it might have felt like to grow up understanding that your very identity was inseparable from an institution whose truth claims you would eventually come to question so thoroughly. What makes Rykard's story compelling from its very earliest chapter, even before his exile or his transformation, is the sense that he never fully accepted this inheritance the way his siblings seemed to. Where Godwyn embraced his role as the golden beloved heir, where Morgott quietly, dutifully shouldered burdens no one else wanted, where Mog pursued his own dark ambitions largely in the shadows without directly confronting the Order itself. Rykard's discontent, by contrast, seems to have been present from early on, a kind of simmering skepticism about whether the promises underlying the entire Golden Order, grace, eternal life through the Erdtree, the sanctity of his mother's authority, actually held the weight everyone around him assumed they did. There's something worth sitting with in imagining what it must have been like to grow up surrounded by siblings who each, in their own way, seemed to believe more completely in the family's divine mission than Rykard himself ever quite managed to. Doubt, when it exists quietly inside someone surrounded by unwavering belief, has a notable loneliness to it, a sense of standing slightly apart from everyone else in the room, even while physically present among them. Whatever specific event or realization eventually pushed Rykard's private doubt into open rejection, the seeds of it appear to have been present long before he ever formally broke from his family's teachings. Something else lingers here, the specific texture of what grace and the golden path actually meant as lived experience for someone born into this family, rather than simply as abstract theology. For Rykard's siblings, faith in the Erdtree likely came wrapped in genuine comfort, the promise that death was not truly final, that grace guided the golden path towards something greater, that the entire structure of their world was eventually good and purposeful. For Rykard, that same promise seems to have curdled into something closer to suspicion. If death was not truly final, why did golden light so often accompany not comfort but subjugation? If grace guided all things, why did so much of what he observed in the world beneath the Erdtree still involve suffering that no amount of golden radiance seemed able to touch or heal? There is also something worth noting about the specific position Rykard occupied within his generation of demigods, distinct from the position his siblings held. Where some of his siblings were groomed early for visible leadership roles, tied directly to the Erdtree's continued authority and public image, Rykard's own early role within the family structure remains less clearly documented, a gap in the record that itself suggests something about how differently he was regarded even before any formal rupture occurred. Whether this relative obscurity reflected genuine disinterest on Rykard's part, deliberate sidelining by Marika or those around her, or simply the natural consequence of a large family with more children than prominent roles to distribute among them, the effect was likely the same either way, a demigod positioned, from very early on, slightly outside the innermost circle of golden legitimacy, his siblings more visibly occupied. One detail stands out: what this arrangement reveals about Rykard's position within Marika's household, distinct from questions of formal rank or public role. Families organised around a singular all-encompassing mission, in this case, the maintenance and expansion of the Golden Order's authority, often develop their own internal hierarchies of belief and commitment, separate from whatever formal titles or responsibilities are officially assigned. Some children internalise the family's mission completely, treating it as inseparable from their own personal identity. Others maintain a more distant, performed relationship to the same mission, participating in its outward rituals while privately reserving judgment about its underlying truth. Rykard's later trajectory suggests he belonged, from quite early on, to this second category, someone capable of participating in his family's golden performance, while never fully surrendering his own private capacity for doubt. There is also something worth noting about how Rykard's position within his generation of demigods might have looked from an outside observer's perspective, someone encountering the family's public presentation without access to whatever private tensions existed beneath it. To most inhabitants of the lands between, the demigods likely appeared as a largely unified extension of Marika's own divine authority, their individual differences and private doubts invisible behind the collective golden radiance the family's public image was designed to project. This gap between outward presentation and inward reality matters because it suggests Rykard's eventual dramatic break from the Golden Order would have come as genuine shock to many observers, a rupture in what had appeared from the outside to be a seamless, unified family enterprise. This connects to something larger, the specific role religious upbringing plays in shaping, and sometimes eventually fracturing, a person's relationship to institutional authority more broadly. Children raised within systems that present their foundational beliefs as simply, obviously true, rather than as one interpretation among many possible ones, often develop a specific kind of relationship to doubt when it eventually arrives, not as gradual, comfortable questioning, but as something closer to a genuine crisis, a sudden and often painful recognition that what once felt like simple, unquestionable reality was in fact a constructed system with its own internal logic, capable of being examined, challenged, and rejected. Rykard's eventual rebellion likely followed something resembling this pattern, Whatever specific private experiences or realizations in the end triggered his shift from quiet doubt to open, total rejection. At some point, whether through a single dramatic confrontation or a slow accumulation of disagreements that eventually became irreconcilable, Rykard's relationship with the Golden Order and with his mother's authority reached a breaking point. The precise mechanics of his departure remain, like much of Elden Ring's lore, somewhat obscured behind fragmentary item descriptions, and the interpretive work required to piece together a coherent narrative from scattered clues. But the outcome is clear regardless of the exact sequence of events. Rykard left, or was pushed out, or some combination of both, and settled into a life defined by explicit opposition to everything the Golden Order claimed to represent. Consider how the ambiguity surrounding the exact circumstances of Rykard's departure actually serves the broader emotional weight of his story, rather than simply representing a gap in available information. Precise, documented accounts of exactly what was said, what specific grievances were aired, what final conversation or confrontation marked the irreversible break between mother and son, might actually diminish the story's resonance by reducing it to a single containable dispute. The ambiguity instead allows the rupture to feel larger, more total, more representative of an accumulated, irreconcilable difference in worldview, rather than simply the product of one specific disagreement that, under different circumstances, might have been resolved through more careful conversation or compromise. This departure carries a weight worth dwelling on, because unlike some of his siblings' more private struggles with their inherited roles, Rykard's break from the Golden Order became public, visible, impossible to quietly paper over. He did not simply withdraw from court life or retreat into private contemplation. He established himself as an active alternative to everything Marika's order stood for, positioning Volcano Manor, the estate he came to control, as a haven explicitly for those the Golden Order had rejected, condemned, or cast aside. There's a deeper thread here. How this public visibility distinguishes Rykard's specific path from what might have been a more survivable, if less philosophically satisfying alternative available to him. A quieter departure, one that avoided directly challenging the Golden Order's authority or building an openly oppositional institution, might have allowed Rykard to simply fade into obscure exile without provoking the kind of sustained institutional attention and eventual condemnation his choices attracted. That he chose visibility and confrontation over quiet survival suggests something important about his underlying priorities. A demigod who valued being truly heard and understood over simply enduring safely at the margins of a world he no longer believed in. There is a distinct irony worth noting in how Rykard's exile actually played out in practice. Rather than being reduced to powerlessness or obscurity, as exile often implies, he instead built something new entirely, a competing centre of influence that operated according to its own rules, drew its own followers, and openly mocked the very institution that had cast him out. This suggests something important about Rykard's character, even at this relatively early stage of his story. He was never someone content to simply disappear quietly once rejected. Rejection, for Rykard, seems to have functioned less as an ending and more as a beginning, an opportunity to build something explicitly oppositional, rather than simply absorbing the shame the Golden Order likely intended his exile to carry. It's worth imagining, too, what this transition must have looked like from the perspective of those still loyal to the Golden Order, watching one of Marika's own children not simply fail to embody the family's divine mission, but actively construct an entire competing philosophy and physical stronghold built around rejecting it. Exile, in most religious or political structures, is meant to remove a threat, to push dissent to the margins where it can be ignored or forgotten. Rykard's exile accomplished the opposite. It gave him room to build something the Golden Order could neither fully control nor entirely ignore, a persistent reminder, visible from across the region, that not everyone beneath the Erdtree accepted its authority without question. There's a strategic quality worth noting in where Rykard finally chose to settle following his break from the Golden Order. Mount Gelmir, with its constant volcanic activity and inhospitable terrain, sits at a meaningful physical remove from Leyndell and the Erdtree's most direct sphere of influence, close enough to remain relevant to the broader political landscape of the lands between, yet distant and dangerous enough to discourage casual interference from those who might otherwise seek to bring him back under control or eliminate him outright. This choice of location speaks to a kind of practical wisdom underlying even his earliest moves as an exile, an understanding that survival, let alone the construction of any lasting alternative to the Golden Order's authority, would require both distance and defensibility in roughly equal measure. This detail matters too, the symbolic resonance of choosing a volcano specifically, rather than any of the land between's other inhospitable or remote regions, as the site for his new domain. Fire and heat carry their own long-standing associations across most mythological traditions, often linked to destruction, transformation, and purification in equal measure. All themes that would come to define Rykard's own eventual trajectory in ways that feel almost too fitting to be entirely coincidental. Whether Rykard chose Mount Gelmir with this symbolism deliberately in mind, or whether the location's practical advantages simply happened to align with thematic resonance that later observers would notice in hindsight, the setting itself has become inseparable from how his broader story is understood and remembered. Notice too how the practical challenges involved in actually establishing a functioning estate within such a hostile volcanic environment, challenges that speak to considerable resources and determination on Rykard's part even in these earlier stages of his exile. Constructing and maintaining a manor capable of housing followers, conducting business, and eventually concealing the transformation that would come to define his later existence, all within terrain that would likely kill an unprepared traveller within days, required not simply architectural ambition but genuine mastery of the specific dangers Mount Gelmir's volcanic activity presented. This early demonstration of competence and resourcefulness, easy to overlook amid the more dramatic later chapters of his story, deserves recognition as evidence that Rykard's later, more elaborate schemes were built atop a genuine foundation of practical capability established from the very beginning of his exile. This says something about how word of Rykard's exile and new domain likely spread throughout the lands between in the immediate aftermath of his break from the Golden Order, before Volcano Manor had fully developed into the sophisticated operation it would eventually become. Early rumours probably framed him simply as a disgraced demigod licking his wounds in inhospitable exile, a narrative the Golden Order likely found convenient to encourage, since it minimised the significance of his rebellion and suggested his eventual fade into irrelevance. That this narrative proved so thoroughly wrong that Rykard instead used his exile as the foundation for something more enduring and threatening likely came as an unwelcome surprise to those who had initially dismissed him as simply another cautionary tale of demigod failure, rather than a genuine ongoing challenge to the Order's authority. Volcano Manor itself deserves careful attention as more than simply Rykard's physical residence. It functions within the broader world of the lands between as a kind of shadow institution, a haven specifically for individuals the Golden Order has branded as Recusants, meaning those who have rejected or been rejected by the established religious and political order. Built into the caldera of Mount Gelmir, surrounded by volcanic terrain that few would consider hospitable, the manor presents an almost deliberately contradictory face to visitors. Outwardly, it offers warmth, wine, hospitality, and the trappings of aristocratic comfort. Beneath that surface, it operates as something far more calculating. One more thread deserves attention here: the sheer architectural ambition involved in constructing a functioning aristocratic estate within an active volcanic caldera, an environment that would seem, at first consideration, almost entirely hostile to the kind of gracious, comfortable living Volcano Manor's public face presents. This achievement speaks to resources and expertise that extend well beyond what a simple exile, cut off from his family's support and standing, might be expected to command on his own. Whoever or whatever assisted Rykard in constructing this improbable estate, whether followers who joined him early in his exile, or perhaps resources and knowledge gained through his eventual communion with older primordial forces, the manor's very existence testifies to a level of capability and determination beyond what his initial rejection from the Golden Order might have suggested he retained. The Recusants who gather at Volcano Manor are not a unified ideological movement in the way the Golden Order presents itself as one. They are more accurately a collection of individuals united primarily by their shared status as outcasts, whatever their original reasons for falling out of favour with the established order. Some arrived seeking refuge, others arrived seeking purpose, a new structure to belong to after being cast out of the one that previously defined them. Rykard, as the manor's master, positioned himself at the centre of this community, offering both protection and, crucially, employment for those willing to serve his notable interests. Something else deserves attention: how the manor's careful blend of protection and employment functions as a kind of soft power, distinct from the more overt authority the Golden Order wields through its religious and political dominance. Rather than commanding obedience through theological claim or institutional legitimacy, Rykard secures loyalty through practical benefit, offering something concrete and immediately valuable to those who arrive at his doors already stripped of whatever status or belonging they once possessed. This model of leadership, built on practical exchange rather than sacred authority, represents in itself a quiet rebuke of the Golden Order's own foundational claims, suggesting that genuine loyalty and community can be built through means entirely separate from divine sanction or golden bloodline. This is where Volcano Manor's true function within the world becomes clear, extending well beyond simple sanctuary. Under Rykard's direction, the manor operates as a network of hired killers, taking on contracts against specific targets scattered throughout the lands between, often other demigods, powerful figures, or individuals who have become inconvenient to someone with the resources to hire the manor's specific services. This transforms Rykard's exile from a simple story of rejection into something closer to quiet, calculated retaliation, using the very people the Golden Order discarded as instruments to strike back against targets connected directly or indirectly to the institution that cast him out in the first place. Beyond that, there's this specific ethical weight carried by this arrangement, particularly regarding the Recusants themselves who carry out the actual violence at the manor's direction. Whatever grievances individually motivate each Recusant's participation in the system, their actions serve Rykard's broader agenda, regardless of whether that agenda aligns with their own personal motivations for accepting a given contract. This raises uncomfortable questions about complicity and manipulation that the story never fully resolves. Questions about whether the Recusants understand themselves as instruments in someone else's larger campaign of retaliation, or whether the Manor's careful compartmentalization of information and purpose keeps most participants comfortably unaware of the broader pattern their individual contracts collectively serve. Here's the deeper question: what this arrangement reveals about Rykard's genius, if genius is even the right word for it. Rather than simply nursing his grievance in isolation, he constructed an entire functioning economy of resentment, one that provided him both material benefit and a kind of ongoing symbolic revenge against the Golden Order, all while maintaining plausible deniability through the layers of intermediaries and contracts that separated him personally from the actual violence being carried out on his behalf. It is patient, methodical, and substantially more sophisticated than the simple image of an embittered exile sulking in a mountain fortress might initially suggest to a newcomer wandering through the Manor's warmly lit halls for the first time. This also reframes the distinct kind of community Volcano Manor represents, distinct from any straightforward military alliance or ideological movement. The Recusants gathered here share little beyond their shared outsider status, and Rykard's genius, insofar as the arrangement can be called that, lies partly in recognizing that shared rejection alone, without requiring genuine ideological unity, could be organized into something functional and profitable. He did not need his followers to believe in his philosophy regarding the Golden Order's dishonesty about death. He needed only their willingness to accept contracts, to serve his interests in exchange for the safety and belonging the Manor offered, regardless of whatever private reasons individually brought each of them to his door in the first place. Consider too the notable psychology of arriving at Volcano Manor as a recusant, someone already rejected or fleeing rejection from the world beneath the Erdtree. For such a person, the Manor's warmth and hospitality likely carries genuine emotional weight, beyond simple strategic convenience, offering something that may have felt entirely unavailable elsewhere, a place where one's outsider status is not simply tolerated, but actively organized into structure and purpose. This emotional dimension helps explain why the Manor's operations continue functioning smoothly, despite their underlying transactional, even mercenary nature. Belonging, once offered to someone who has known rejection, tends to inspire loyalty more durable than payment alone could ever secure. Zoom out. How Volcano Manor's model of belonging differs meaningfully from what the Golden Order itself offered its own adherents. Where the Erdtree's authority demanded conformity to a singular unified vision of grace and golden destiny, Volcano Manor asks significantly less of those who arrive at its doors, requiring only a willingness to serve its practical interests, rather than genuine ideological alignment with Rykard's own specific philosophy. This lower barrier to belonging likely proved more accessible to a wide range of outcasts than the Golden Order's demanding, all-encompassing, theological framework ever was, allowing Rykard's operation to draw followers from across a notably broader range of backgrounds and original grievances than a more ideologically rigid movement could have managed. The same pattern shows up elsewhere. The sheer diversity of backgrounds likely represented among the Recusants who eventually find their way to Volcano Manor's doors. Some may have been cast out for genuine theological disagreement, echoing in smaller scale Rykard's own eventual break from the Golden Order. Others may have simply run afoul of political rivals within the Erdtree's complex web of alliances, their exile having little to do with genuine philosophical conviction and everything to do with the ordinary machinery of court politics and power struggles. Still others may have never held any formal standing within the Golden Order at all, arriving instead as wanderers or tarnished, who found themselves drawn to the Manor's promise of purpose and belonging regardless of their prior relationship to the Erdtree's authority. This diversity, rather than weakening the Manor's cohesion, likely strengthened it, creating a community bound together by function and mutual need rather than the more fragile bonds of shared ideology alone. Central to Volcano Manor's day-to-day function is Tanith, the figure who serves as the Manor's primary point of contact for visitors and, crucially, for those willing to take on the assassination contracts that fund and empower Rykard's ongoing operation. Something else lingers here. How Tanith's careful management of the Manor's operations reflects a kind of practical wisdom regarding sustainable institution building distinct from the more overtly ideological or theological concerns that typically animate discussions of the Golden Order's authority. Running an operation that depends on continuously attracting new recusants, maintaining their loyalty and productivity, and managing the delicate balance between hospitality and transaction requires skills more mundane, in the best sense of that word, than the grand philosophical questions Rykard himself grapples with in his isolated chambers. This division of labour, philosophical conviction housed apart from practical management, likely proved essential to the Manor's continued functioning across whatever extended time frame it operated before a Tarnished eventually arrived to bring Rykard's story to its final conclusion. Tanith's role deserves distinct attention because she represents the human face of an operation that, at its foundation, involves considerable violence carried out at a careful remove from Rykard himself. One detail stands out: how Tanith's own personal history and motivations might inform her approach to running the Manor's day-to-day operations. Whatever brought her originally to Volcano Manor's doors, whether shared conviction regarding the Golden Order's failures, simple pragmatic self-interest, or some more complicated combination of both, her sustained commitment to maintaining the Manor's operations over what appears to be an extended period suggests genuine investment in the Enterprise's continued success, beyond what simple employment or coercion alone might typically produce. This raises its own quiet questions about a specific relationship to Rykard, questions the surviving records leave largely unanswered, but that add further texture to understanding the Manor as a genuine community bound by more than pure transaction. Tanith presents herself with a kind of practiced, almost seductive hospitality, the perfect embodiment of the Manor's outward-facing charm, offering wine, warm words, and an invitation to belong to something larger than whatever isolation or rejection brought a given visitor to the Manor's doors in the first place. Beneath this hospitality, however, operates a far more transactional logic. Visitors are assessed, evaluated, and eventually offered the opportunity to prove their worth through contracts against specific targets, contracts that, once accepted, tie the visitor increasingly deeply into the Manor's operations and by extension into service to Rykard's broader goals. This structure, warm invitation on the surface, calculated transaction underneath, mirrors something essential about Rykard's own character, even though he himself remains largely absent from these direct interactions. For most of a visitor's time at the Manor, he does not personally recruit, he does not personally negotiate. He allows Tanith and the Manor's broader culture of hospitality to do that work, remaining himself a distant, almost mythologized presence, somewhere deeper within the Manor structure, encountered only after a visitor has proven themselves useful enough, or curious enough, or persistent enough to be granted access to whatever waits at the centre of everything. It's worth pausing to consider what this notable arrangement suggests about how Rykard has come to understand power in the year since his exile. Direct confrontation, the kind that once presumably characterised whatever conflict led to his break from the Golden Order, has given way to something more patient and indirect. Influence exercised through intermediaries, violence carried out by hired hands rather than his own. a reputation built and maintained by others speaking on his behalf, rather than through his own direct, visible presence in the world. This shift in approach becomes significant later in his story, once the full extent of what he's actually been working toward deep within the Manor's most hidden chambers finally comes into view. This connects to something larger, the emotional labour Tanith's role requires, distinct from the more straightforwardly transactional aspects of contract negotiation. Maintaining the Manor's warm, welcoming atmosphere for a rotating cast of outcasts, killers, and desperate wanderers, all while quietly managing the underlying machinery of violence that atmosphere is designed to obscure, demands a specific kind of sustained performance. Whether Tanith herself fully shares Rykard's philosophical convictions regarding the Golden Order, or whether her role is simply the professional execution of duties assigned to her within the Manor's hierarchy, remains honestly unclear from available records. Another one of the many ambiguities that make Rykard's story, and the story of everyone orbiting around him, resistant to simple, comfortable resolution. Think about the targets the Manor's contracts tend to pursue, and what pattern, if any, emerges from examining them collectively. Many of the figures targeted through Volcano Manor's assassination network share some connection, however indirect, to the Golden Order's continued authority or to political arrangements that benefit the Erdtree's broader interests. This pattern, if genuine rather than coincidental, suggests that Rykard's operation, however financially motivated on its surface, continues serving his original, deeper grievance against the institution that exiled him, using the Manor's mercenary structure as cover for what amounts to an ongoing patient campaign of retaliation against targets connected, in ways visible or hidden, to the very authority he spent his early life rejecting. Pull on this thread a little. How this arrangement positions the Tarnished themselves, those wandering souls drawn to the lands between in pursuit of the Elden Ring, within Rykard's broader scheme. Many Tarnished who encounter Volcano Manor arrive already desperate, already searching for purpose or resources wherever they can find them, making them ideal candidates for exactly the kind of contract work the Manor specialises in offering. Rykard's operation, in this sense, does not simply exploit existing recusants who arrive already committed to opposing the Golden Order. It actively recruits from among the wandering, purposeless Tarnished themselves, drawing them into service of his broader agenda, often without those Tarnished fully understanding the deeper motivations underlying the contracts they accept, motivations that extend beyond the straightforward payment being offered for services rendered. One more piece belongs here: the distinct question of loyalty within this arrangement, and how the Manor manages to secure meaningful commitment from followers whose primary relationship to the operation is fundamentally transactional rather than ideological. Contracts alone rarely inspire the kind of deep loyalty an operation like Volcano Manor eventually requires to function smoothly over extended periods. The Manor's genius, then, likely lies in gradually transforming what begins as simple transaction into something closer to genuine belonging, using repeated successful contracts, shared danger, and the accumulated social bonds formed among fellow recusants to create loyalty substantially more durable than payment alone could ever secure, echoing the same pattern of belonging through purpose that likely drew many recusants to the Manor's doors in the first place. Before his current arrangement at Volcano Manor, before the transformation that would eventually earn him his infamous title, Rykard's life intersected with one of the lands between's other major political and magical dynasties through his marriage to Rennala, then reigning as part of the Carian royal family centred in Liurnia. This marriage represented at the time a significant political alliance, joining Rykard's status as one of Marika's demigod children with Rennala's own considerable standing and magical authority within Karia's sorcery-focused tradition. Notice, too, how what daily life might have looked like during whatever period Rykard and Rennala's marriage functioned as intended, before whatever circumstances eventually led to its dissolution. Two demigod-adjacent figures, each carrying their own family's considerable weight of expectation and authority, building a shared life together, likely required navigating not simply ordinary marital compromise but the added complexity of representing jointly the union of two significant political and magical traditions. Whatever genuine partnership existed between them during this period deserves acknowledgement as more than simply a footnote preceding Rennala's eventual departure, a period worth imagining as its own complete chapter of Rykard's life, before everything that followed reshaped how that earlier chapter is typically remembered. What became of this marriage carries its own weight within Rykard's broader story, one worth handling with the same careful attention as his other losses. Rennala's path eventually diverged from Rykard's, and she came instead to marry Radagon, a union that, viewed through the wider lens of Elden Ring's tangled mythology, carried enormous consequences, eventually producing children who would themselves become central figures within the Lands Between's unfolding history. For Rykard, watching this unfold meant watching a marriage he had once been part of dissolve in favour of a union that more directly served the Golden Order's continued consolidation of power. This says something about the specific timing of this dissolution relative to Rykard's own gradual accumulation of doubt regarding the Golden Order's broader authority. If his marriage to Rennala ended while he still maintained at least some outward connection to the Golden Order, the loss itself may have functioned as an early catalyst for doubts that had not yet fully crystallized into the total philosophical rejection he eventually arrived at. Alternatively, if this loss occurred after his doubts were already well established, it may have simply confirmed and deepened convictions he had already begun forming. One more piece of evidence supporting a conclusion he was already moving toward regardless of this notable personal circumstance. There is something worth sitting with in how this loss might have compounded whatever doubts and resentments Rykard was already nursing toward the Golden Order more broadly. It is one thing to intellectually reject an institution's theology and authority. It is another thing entirely to watch that same institution effectively absorb something personal, something that had once belonged distinctly to you, repurposing it toward its own continued consolidation of power and legitimacy. Whether Rennala's departure directly accelerated Rykard's break from the Golden Order, or whether it simply confirmed doubts he already privately held, the timing and nature of this loss feels significant to understanding the specific flavour of bitterness that eventually defined so much of his later philosophy and choices. One more thread deserves attention here. This loss from a slightly different angle, not simply as personal betrayal, but as one more piece of evidence, from Rykard's own perspective, that the Golden Order operated according to a logic of consumption and consolidation, rather than genuine grace or fairness. Marriages, alliances, even entire family lines seem to exist, in his eventual worldview, primarily to serve the Order's continued expansion and legitimacy. Individual relationships and personal history treated as resources to be redirected wherever they proved most politically useful. That framework, once adopted, would go on to shape nearly everything about how Rykard eventually chose to define himself in direct, explicit opposition to it. There's a quality worth noting in how this specific loss differs from the more abstract theological doubts Rykard may have already harboured. Losing Rennala was not a matter of contested doctrine or philosophical disagreement about the nature of grace and death. It was concrete, personal, and irreversible, the kind of loss that tends to reshape how a person relates to institutional authority far more powerfully than abstract argument ever could. Whatever genuine affection existed between Rykard and Rennala during their marriage, its dissolution in favour of an alliance more directly beneficial to the Golden Order's consolidation of power likely taught Rykard, in the most visceral way possible, exactly how little his own personal happiness or standing mattered when weighed against the institution's broader strategic interests. How Rennala's own later trajectory might have appeared from Rykard's perspective in the years following their separation. Her subsequent marriage to Radagon eventually produced children who would themselves become central figures within the unfolding drama of the lands between, individuals whose own considerable significance within the world's mythology stands in stark, almost painful contrast to whatever future Rykard's own union with Rennala might have produced had it continued. Watching, from a distance, as a former marriage transforms into something historically significant, while one's own subsequent path leads instead toward exile, rejection, and eventual monstrous transformation, carries its own distinct bitterness worth acknowledging, even if the story never states this comparison explicitly. Something else deserves attention. How the political circumstances surrounding Rennala's eventual marriage to Radagon reflect the same underlying logic Rykard came to identify and resent throughout the Golden Order's broader operations. The union between Carrier's sorcery tradition and the Golden Order's central authority served concrete political purposes, ending whatever conflict or tension existed between these two significant power centres within the lands between. Rennala herself, whatever her own personal feelings on the matter, became in this sense less an individual making a free personal choice and more a strategic asset, whose marriage served the Golden Order's broader interests in consolidating and stabilising its authority across the wider region. Rykard's own earlier marriage to her, viewed retrospectively through this lens, may have always carried similar political dimensions, a reminder that even personal relationships within this world rarely existed entirely outside the broader currents of power and strategic advantage that the Golden Order's authority touched. Whether any genuine warmth or affection persisted between Rykard and Rennala even after their separation, buried beneath the political and theological currents that in the end separated them. The historical record offers little to confirm or deny this possibility, but it remains worth holding open as a genuine question, rather than assuming their relationship simply curdled entirely into bitterness and strategic calculation on both sides. People who once shared genuine intimacy rarely lose every trace of that connection entirely, even when circumstance and institutional pressure pull them toward entirely different paths. Whatever combination of lingering affection, resentment, and simple resigned acceptance characterized Rykard's private feelings toward his former wife, that complexity likely added its own weight to the broader accumulation of grievances that eventually drove him toward his final, irreversible break from everything the Golden Order represented. By the time Rykard had fully settled into his role as Master of Volcano Manor, his opposition to the Golden Order had crystallized into something more developed than simple personal grievance. He had arrived at a genuine articulated philosophical position, one that rejected not simply his mother's specific authority, but the entire theological framework underlying the Erdtree's promise of grace, golden lineage, and the sanctity of the ordered world it claimed to guarantee. On top of that, there's the notable difficulty of articulating a fully coherent alternative philosophy while still embedded, at least partially, within the very system one is attempting to reject. Rykard's rejection of the Golden Order did not emerge in a vacuum, uninfluenced by the theological vocabulary and conceptual frameworks he had been raised within. Even his most radical departures from Golden Order doctrine likely still employed, at least initially, concepts and categories inherited from that same doctrine, simply repurposed or inverted to serve his new oppositional philosophy. This suggests that genuine philosophical rebellion, however total it eventually becomes, rarely starts from pure unconditioned first principles, but instead works its way gradually free from inherited frameworks, even while using pieces of those same frameworks as the initial tools for that liberation. At the centre of Rykard's rejection sits a conviction about death and about the Golden Order's relationship to it. Where the Erdtree's teaching promised that death was not truly final, that grace and the Golden Path offered something beyond simple mortal ending, Rykard came to view this promise as fundamentally dishonest, a comforting fiction maintained less because it was true and more because it served the Order's continued authority over the people who believed in it. If death could be recontextualized as merely a transition rather than a true ending, then those who controlled the mechanisms of grace and resurrection effectively controlled something far more powerful than simple political authority. They controlled the terms on which mortality itself operated. Here's the deeper question: how this specific insight regarding control over mortality connects to broader questions of institutional power that extend well beyond the specific theological context of the Golden Order. Any system, religious or otherwise, that positions itself as the sole legitimate arbiter of what happens after death gains, through that positioning, a form of authority that touches nearly every other aspect of how people organize their lives and priorities while still living. Fear of death, and hope for whatever comes after it, represent some of the most powerful motivating forces available to any institution seeking genuine, lasting control over a population. Rykard's insight into this dynamic, however extreme the conclusions he eventually drew from it, identifies something really significant about how the Golden Order's authority actually functioned in practice, beyond its more surface-level theological claims about grace and golden destiny. This insight, whether Rykard arrived at it through careful philosophical reasoning, or through the more visceral experience of watching people he cared about consumed by the Order's machinery, became the foundation for everything he pursued afterward. If the Golden Order's promise regarding death was, in his assessment, finally a lie serving power rather than a genuine truth serving the people who believed it, then true freedom required finding some alternative relationship to mortality entirely, one that didn't depend on grace, on golden lineage, or on any of the mechanisms the Erdtree used to maintain its authority over life and death. This also reframes how this conviction, once fully formed, would have necessarily reshaped Rykard's entire relationship to time and purpose going forward. A person who accepts the Golden Order's promise regarding continuation after death might reasonably organize their life's priorities around eventual reunion with the Erdtree, treating mortal existence as preparation for something greater still to come. Rykard, having rejected this framework entirely, faced instead the significantly more urgent, immediate question of what genuine continuation, if any, might actually be achievable within mortal existence itself, a question that likely drove the increasingly desperate and extreme measures he eventually pursued in seeking out Theodorix. This philosophical position, radical as it was, still operated within a framework recognizably shaped by the very institution Rykard rejected. He did not simply walk away from questions of mortality and power entirely, content to live an ordinary life free from either concern. He remained deeply preoccupied with exactly the same fundamental questions that defined the Golden Order's entire theological project. What happens after death? Who controls that process? And what genuine power over mortality might actually look like if pursued through means entirely outside the Erdtree's sanctioned path. In this sense, Rykard's rebellion, however sincere, never fully escaped the gravitational pull of the very ideology it was rebelling against. He simply sought answers to the same essential questions through a radically different and far more dangerous method. How thoroughly this conviction likely reshaped Rykard's relationships, with everyone still connected to the Golden Order, including whatever remained of his relationships with his own siblings. Once someone arrives at the conclusion that the entire theological structure their family's authority rests upon is fundamentally dishonest, maintaining any kind of ordinary relationship with those who continue believing in that structure becomes more difficult. Every interaction, however superficially cordial, would have carried the weight of this fundamental disagreement, an unspoken chasm between Rykard's private conviction and whatever public performance of family unity the Golden Order's continued authority may have still required of him during whatever transitional period existed between his growing doubt and his eventual total break. There's a distinct intellectual courage, however dangerous its eventual consequences, required to arrive at and then act upon this specific conclusion regarding the Golden Order's relationship to death. Most inhabitants of the lands between, including presumably most of Rykard's own siblings, appear to have accepted the Erdtree's promises regarding grace and continuation without subjecting them to the kind of sustained skeptical scrutiny Rykard eventually applied. Whether this reflects genuine faith on their part, or simply the practical impossibility of maintaining ordinary daily life while constantly questioning the foundational assumptions underlying one's entire society, Rykard's willingness to pursue his doubt all the way to its logical, uncomfortable conclusions sets him apart from nearly everyone else within his family and social position. Widen the lens a bit. How this philosophical position regarding death and grace connects to broader patterns of skepticism that appear in various forms throughout the Lands Between's history, even beyond Rykard's own specific story. The Golden Order's authority, however dominant and seemingly unquestionable it may have appeared from within, was never entirely free from challenge or doubt, even among figures who eventually chose not to act on that doubt, as dramatically as Rykard eventually did. Recognizing Rykard's philosophical position as part of this broader pattern, rather than as an isolated aberration unique to his notable circumstances, helps contextualize his eventual choices as an extreme, but not entirely unprecedented response to tensions and contradictions that existed, in some form, throughout the Golden Order's entire theological and political structure. What specific evidence or experience might have first planted this seed of doubt in Rykard's mind, long before it grew into the fully articulated philosophical position that eventually justified his communion with Theodorix? Perhaps it was witnessing the suffering of ordinary people beneath the Erdtree's supposed grace, suffering that never seemed to diminish despite generations of golden rule. Perhaps it was some more personal disillusionment, a specific broken promise or betrayal that first cracked his faith in the larger system's fundamental honesty. Whatever the specific catalyst, the pattern that eventually emerged suggests someone who demanded that abstract theological promises actually correspond to observable reality, refusing to simply accept comforting doctrine when the lived experience of those around him told a notably more complicated, less reassuring story. Rykard's search for an alternative path to power over death eventually led him to Theodorix, one of the great primordial serpents that predate much of the Lands Between's current order, older than the Erdtree's current dominance, connected to forces and forms of power that existed before Marika's golden vision reshaped the world according to her specific theology. Where the Golden Order offered grace, lineage, and the promise of eventual reunion with the Erdtree, the primordial serpents represented something older and less domesticated, raw, hungry, predatory power that answered to no established religious or political structure. The same pattern shows up elsewhere. How Rykard might have first encountered knowledge of Theodorix's existence, given how thoroughly the Golden Order's dominance had, by this point in the Lands Between's history, suppressed or marginalized most surviving traditions connected to these older primordial forces. Perhaps fragments of pre-Erdtree lore survived among certain isolated communities or hidden archives, preserved despite generations of Golden Order suppression. Perhaps Rykard's own position as a demigod granted him access to restricted knowledge unavailable to ordinary inhabitants of the Lands Between, knowledge the Golden Order maintained privately, even while publicly suppressing broader awareness of these older traditions among the general population. Either possibility suggests that genuine alternatives to the Golden Order's authority never fully disappeared, persisting instead in whatever margins and shadows the dominant order failed to completely erase. The specific appeal of Theodorix and the broader concept of serpent communion, as Rykard came to understand and pursue it, centered on the idea that the serpents possessed a fundamentally different relationship to mortality than anything the Golden Order offered. Rather than promising eventual transcendence through grace and golden lineage, the serpent's power operated through consumption and integration, quite literally absorbing whatever they devoured into their own ongoing existence, offering a form of continuation that had nothing to do with the Erdtree's sanctioned mechanisms and everything to do with primal, almost animalistic persistence through consumption rather than grace. Something else lingers here: how this model of continuation through consumption might have appealed to Rykard specifically, given everything else his story reveals about his experience of loss and betrayal at the Golden Order's hands, where grace, as he experienced it, proved conditional, contingent on institutional favour that could be withdrawn or redirected according to political calculation. The serpent's power offered something that felt, at least conceptually, far more absolute and unconditional. Once consumed and integrated, that continuation could not simply be revoked or redirected by some distant institutional authority, the way his marriage to Rennala or his standing among his siblings in the end proved to be. This promise of a form of persistence beyond institutional control likely carried distinct emotional weight for someone who had already experienced, repeatedly, exactly how conditional and revocable the Golden Order's own promises of grace and belonging actually turned out to be in practice. For someone who had already concluded that the Golden Order's promise regarding death was fundamentally dishonest, this alternative likely held tremendous appeal precisely because of how thoroughly it rejected everything the Erdtree represented. Where grace offered a comforting, orderly, sanctioned path toward continued existence, the serpent's power offered something rawer and less comfortable to contemplate. Survival and continuation purchased not through divine favour, but through appetite, through consumption, through a willingness to become something the Golden Order would immediately and unambiguously condemn as monstrous. It's worth sitting with what it must have taken, psychologically, for Rykard to arrive at the point of actively pursuing this path, rather than simply theorising about it from a safe philosophical distance. Rejecting the Golden Order intellectually is one thing. Actively seeking out one of the primordial serpents, understanding fully what communion with such a being would eventually require of him, represents a substantially more extreme commitment to his rejection of everything he had been raised to believe. Whatever combination of genuine philosophical conviction, personal bitterness, and perhaps a degree of simple hunger for power drove this pursuit, the decision to seek out Theodorix marks the point where Rykard's rebellion stopped being merely theoretical and started becoming something more irreversible. One detail stands out: what the primordial serpents themselves represent within the broader mythological structure of the lands between, beyond simply their utility to Rykard's philosophical project. These beings predate the current golden order of things entirely, connected to an older layer of the world's history that the Erdtree's rise to dominance never fully erased, merely suppressed or pushed to the margins. Seeking out Theodorix, then, was not simply a matter of finding a convenient alternative source of power. It represented a deliberate reconnection with something the Golden Order had spent generations trying to bury, a choice that carried significance well beyond Rykard's personal circumstances, touching on much older and more fundamental tensions between the world's current Golden Order and whatever came before it. This connects to something larger: the specific journey Rykard must have undertaken to actually locate and eventually commune with Theodorix, a process that, however sparse the surviving records describing it, must have required considerable time, resources, and quite possibly the assistance of others already familiar with the older, pre-Erdtree traditions surrounding these primordial beings. This suggests Rykard's rebellion was never purely a solitary intellectual exercise, but likely involved seeking out knowledge and connections that existed largely outside the Golden Order's sanctioned channels of information and history, further deepening his practical, lived commitment to an alternative tradition long before his physical transformation ever actually occurred. Picture the notable nature of Theodorix specifically, as distinct from the broader category of primordial serpents that exist throughout the Lands Between's older mythology. Great Wyrms of this kind appear to occupy a status significantly above ordinary predatory beasts, closer to something approaching divine or semi-divine standing within whatever older religious framework existed before the Golden Order's rise to dominance. Seeking communion specifically with a being of this stature, rather than pursuing some lesser or more easily accessible source of alternative power, suggests Rykard understood, even before undertaking this path, that genuine escape from the Golden Order's authority over death would require engaging with power on a scale roughly comparable to what the Erdtree itself commanded, rather than settling for some lesser, insufficiently potent alternative. Something else runs underneath this: what Theodorix itself might have gained, or sought, from accepting Rykard's communion rather than treating the exchange as purely one-directional, benefiting only the demigod seeking its power. Primordial beings of this scale and age likely operate according to motivations and logic removed from ordinary mortal concerns, and the surviving records offer little insight into whatever calculus led Theodorix to accept this communion, rather than simply devouring Rykard as it might any other creature that wandered too close. Perhaps some older mutual tradition of exchange existed between serpents of this kind and those willing to offer themselves in this specific way. Perhaps Theodorix's own motivations remain, and will likely always remain, as alien and unknowable as the being itself, a reminder that not every relationship formed within this story operates according to logic fully legible to human or even demigod understanding. The act at the centre of Rykard's transformation, allowing himself to be devoured by the Great Wyrm, integrating his own body and consciousness with the serpent's ancient predatory form, represents one of the most extreme choices made by any figure in the Lands Between's broader mythology. This was not a subtle transformation, not a gradual shift in belief or allegiance. It was a total, physical, irreversible act of self-sacrifice and simultaneous self-transcendence, trading his original demigod form for something notably stranger and, by the Golden Order's own theological standards, unambiguously monstrous. A smaller detail carries weight. The specific vocabulary available, or unavailable, for describing an act this far outside ordinary human or even demigod experience. Words like sacrifice, transformation, communion, and consumption each capture some dimension of what occurred, yet none fully encompasses the totality of what Rykard actually underwent. This linguistic insufficiency matters because it suggests something truly novel about his choice, an act that pushed beyond the existing conceptual categories the Lands Between's inhabitants had previously used to understand transformation, death, and identity, forcing observers and later interpreters alike to reach for approximate language rather than precise description when attempting to convey what his communion with Theodorix actually involved. Understanding why Rykard chose this path requires holding two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. On one level, this act represents genuine philosophical commitment carried through to its logical, extreme conclusion. If the Golden Order's promise regarding death was truly a lie, then finding an authentic alternative required a correspondingly total commitment, not simply intellectual rejection, but complete physical transformation into something that existed entirely outside the Erdtree sanctioned categories of life, death, and grace. On another level, this act also represents something closer to genuine desperation, a demigod who had already lost so much: his place within the Golden Order, his marriage to Rennala, his standing among his siblings, finally reaching for the one form of power that no one, not even the Golden Order itself, could take away from him afterward. Notice too how these two explanations, philosophical conviction and personal desperation, need not actually be understood as mutually exclusive alternatives competing for primacy in Rykard's motivation. Human decision-making, and presumably demigod decision-making as well, rarely operates according to single, isolated motives. It's entirely plausible, perhaps even likely, that both genuine philosophical conviction and accumulated personal desperation work together, each reinforcing the other, to produce a decision that neither factor alone might have been sufficient to fully explain. This complexity resists the simpler narrative some retellings of his story might prefer, but it likely comes closer to capturing the genuine tangled psychology underlying his ultimate choice. The physical and metaphysical reality of what Rykard actually became through this communion resist easy, comfortable description. He did not simply gain new abilities while remaining recognizably himself. He fused, quite literally, with the serpent's form, becoming something that existed in the uncomfortable space between demigod and monster, between the theological categories the Golden Order relied on to make sense of the world. This liminal status, neither fully the demigod he once was, nor simply a serpent that happened to retain some human characteristics, becomes central to understanding why his transformation was received with such distinct horror by those who remained loyal to the Golden Order's worldview. What this transformation cost Rykard personally deserves its own attention beyond the obvious physical change. Whatever remained of his original identity, his memories, his relationships, his sense of himself as Marika's son, and a figure with a legitimate standing within the Lands Between social and political order, all of it now existed within a form the rest of the world would perceive, immediately and viscerally, as something to be feared and destroyed rather than reasoned with or understood. He purchased his freedom from the Golden Order's authority over death, but he purchased it at the cost of his own recognizable humanity, a trade that raises uncomfortable questions the story never fully resolves about whether the freedom he achieved was actually worth what it demanded of him. There's a horror worth acknowledging in trying to imagine the actual experience of communion itself, insofar as any narration can meaningfully speculate about an act this alien to ordinary human or even demigod experience. Being consumed, quite literally, by an ancient predatory being, and somehow surviving that consumption not through rescue or escape, but through a kind of willing integration into the creature's own ongoing existence, resists easy comparison to anything in more conventional storytelling. It is neither simple death nor simple survival, but something that occupies an uncomfortable space between the two, a transformation that required Rykard to actively participate in his own consumption rather than simply enduring it as something done to him against his will. The specific nature of consent and agency involved in this transformation, questions that the surviving records never fully resolve, but that seem important to sit with regardless. Did Rykard fully understand, going into this act of communion, exactly what would be required of him, exactly how thoroughly his original form and consciousness would need to be sacrificed and reshaped in the process? Or did the actual experience of communion reveal costs and consequences he had not fully anticipated, even given his deep philosophical commitment to escaping the Golden Order's authority by whatever means necessary? This uncertainty matters because it shapes how we might understand his subsequent isolation and apparent cruelty. As the fully intended outcome of a choice made with complete understanding, or as something closer to a demigod grappling, imperfectly and perhaps regretfully, with consequences far more extreme than he had originally bargained for. This says something about how Rykard's transformation compares structurally to other forms of profound bodily and identity change that appear throughout the Lands Between's broader mythology, from various forms of undeath to other instances of communion with non-human forces. What distinguishes Rykard's notable transformation is the degree of apparent agency and deliberation involved. Where many other transformations throughout this world's history appear to happen to their subjects, imposed through curse, disease, or circumstance beyond their control, Rykard's communion with Theodorix represents something closer to an active, chosen embrace of monstrousness, undertaken with at least some understanding of what it would require, even if the full weight of that understanding only became clear once the transformation was already irreversibly underway. One more thread deserves attention here: the specific timeline of Rykard's transformation relative to the broader unfolding of events throughout the Lands Between, particularly relative to the shattering itself, the great fracture and conflict among the demigods that eventually consumes much of the world's stability. Whether Rykard's communion with Theodorix occurred before, during, or in some sense as a contributing catalyst to the broader shattering, remains ambiguous within the surviving records, but the question matters because it shapes how we understand his transformation's broader significance. If his communion preceded the shattering, it stands as an early, isolated act of extreme rebellion that perhaps helped destabilize the Golden Order's authority in ways that made the later, broader conflict among the demigods more likely. If it occurred during or in response to the shattering's own unfolding chaos, it becomes instead one demigod's response to a crisis already well underway, a specific choice made amid broader circumstances rather than an isolated trigger for everything that followed. Once news of Rykard's transformation reached the broader Golden Order, the response was swift and unambiguous in its condemnation. What Rykard understood as a legitimate, if extreme, philosophical rejection of a dishonest theological promise, the Golden Order understood as nothing less than blasphemy in the most literal damning sense of the word. A demigod, born of Marika's own lineage, willingly abandoning his sanctioned form and communing with forces the Order considered fundamentally opposed to everything the Erdtree represented. Something else deserves attention. How quickly, and through what specific channels, news of Rykard's transformation likely spread throughout the lands between once it became known, given how significant an event this represented within the broader religious and political landscape governed by the Golden Order. Official condemnation from Leyndell likely travelled through formal religious channels, reaching temples, shrines, and officially sanctioned representatives of the Golden Order scattered throughout the region. But informal rumour and speculation almost certainly moved faster and further, distorted and embellished through repeated retelling, in ways that likely shaped popular understanding of Rykard's transformation before any official, authoritative account could catch up and correct whatever exaggerations or misunderstandings had already taken root among ordinary people trying to make sense of what one of Marika's own children had actually done. The title, Lord of Blasphemy, whatever grim satisfaction Rykard may have eventually taken in wearing it, began as pure condemnation, a label meant to permanently mark him as beyond redemption, beyond the possibility of eventual reconciliation with the family and institution he had so thoroughly rejected. This matters because it illustrates something important about how the Golden Order maintained its authority more broadly, not simply through positive promises of grace and golden continuation, but through the corresponding threat of total exile and condemnation for anyone who dared reject those promises as thoroughly and visibly as Rykard finally did. Add to this the specific linguistic weight carried by the specific word chosen for this condemnation. The Golden Order could have selected any number of terms to describe Rykard's rejection and transformation, ranging from simple exile to outright heresy to more clinical descriptions of his physical change. That blasphemy specifically became the operative term suggests a deliberate emphasis on the sacrilegious, almost personally offensive nature of his rejection, framing it not simply as political dissent or even theological disagreement, but as a direct, intimate affront against the sacred itself. This framing choice likely served the Golden Order's broader interests, transforming what might otherwise have been understood as a legitimate philosophical disagreement into something substantially more visceral and condemnable, harder for ordinary believers to sympathise with, regardless of whatever genuine merit Rykard's underlying critique of the Order's promises might have actually possessed. There is irony worth noting in how thoroughly Rykard seems to have embraced this condemnation rather than resisting it. Where a different figure might have sought some way to soften the Golden Order's judgment, to argue for a more nuanced understanding of his choices, Rykard instead appears to have leaned fully into the identity of blasphemer, treating the Golden Order's harshest possible condemnation not as a wound to be healed, but as confirmation that he had successfully broken free from an institution whose approval he no longer sought or valued. Here's the deeper question: what this distinct strategy of embracing condemnation rather than resisting it suggests about Rykard's broader psychological resilience, or perhaps his broader capacity for a certain kind of grim, defiant humour in the face of institutional judgment. Rather than allowing the Golden Order's harshest possible label to diminish him, he transformed it into something closer to a badge of honour, a reversal that requires considerable inner strength, or alternatively, considerable practiced detachment from whatever residual desire for his family's approval he may have once carried. This capacity for reframing condemnation as validation likely served him well throughout the increasingly isolated remainder of his existence, providing a kind of psychological armour against a world that had, by this point, almost universally turned against him. If blasphemy was the price of genuine freedom from the Golden Order's control over death and meaning, Rykard seems to have concluded, then blasphemy was a price worth paying without complaint or apology. How this branding functioned within the broader, political and religious landscape of the lands between, beyond simply Rykard's own personal relationship to the label, by officially condemning Rykard as a blasphemer, the Golden Order reinforced, for everyone still loyal to its teachings, exactly what kind of fate awaited anyone who considered following a similar path of rejection and transformation. Rykard's condemnation served a purpose larger than simply punishing one wayward demigod. It functioned as a warning, a cautionary example meant to discourage anyone else who might harbour similar doubts about the Order's promises from ever acting on them as completely and irreversibly as Rykard did. There is also something worth noting about how titles of condemnation, once applied by a dominant institution, tend to take on a life of their own regardless of how the condemned individual personally chooses to relate to them. Lord of Blasphemy likely circulated throughout the lands between not merely as an official Golden Order designation, but as common parlance among ordinary people, travellers and other factions entirely, each of whom would have understood the title's weight through the lens of their own relationship to the Golden Order's authority. For those still devout, the title likely confirmed everything frightening and monstrous about what Rykard had become. For those already sceptical of the Golden Order themselves, the same title may have carried a very different, almost admiring resonance, marking Rykard as someone who had dared to act on doubts many others harboured privately, but never found the courage or opportunity to pursue as completely as he eventually did. This branding as blasphemer would also have affected Rykard's remaining more distant relationships with figures throughout the lands between, who existed outside the Golden Order's direct authority entirely. Other factions, other outcasts, other figures who themselves occupied ambiguous or hostile relationships to the Erdtree's dominance. For some of these figures, Rykard's transformation and subsequent condemnation may have granted him a strange kind of credibility, evidence that he had honestly committed to opposing the established order rather than simply posturing at rebellion while quietly hoping for eventual reconciliation. This reputation likely proved useful in recruiting Recusants to Volcano Manor's operations, offering potential followers concrete proof that their new lord's opposition to the Golden Order was neither performative nor easily reversed. This also reframes the concept of blasphemy itself, functions within religious systems more broadly, beyond simply its specific application to Rykard's case. Blasphemy, as a category of transgression, exists specifically to mark violations that strike at a religious system's core claims to legitimacy and truth, distinguishing it from more ordinary forms of rule-breaking or disobedience that might threaten specific practices without challenging the underlying theological framework itself. By branding Rykard specifically as a blasphemer, rather than simply as an exile or a traitor, the Golden Order signalled that his notable offence struck at something significantly more fundamental than mere political disagreement. He had not simply disobeyed his mother's authority, he had directly, publicly challenged the truth claims underlying the entire religious system her authority rested upon, a distinction that explains both the severity of his condemnation and the resonance his story continues to carry for those who encounter it. Whether Marika herself, watching from whatever distance separated her from her exiled son's eventual transformation, felt anything resembling grief, anger, or perhaps even a private, unspoken recognition of the validity underlying his doubt, however much she may have needed to publicly condemn his choices to maintain the Golden Order's continued stability. Mothers and their children rarely relate to each other purely through the abstract categories of theological doctrine and political authority, even when those categories dominate the public record of their relationship. Whatever private complexity existed beneath Marika's official condemnation of her blasphemous son, the surviving records offer no direct window into it, leaving this specific dimension of Rykard's story as one more open question among the many his life and transformation continue to raise. Rykard's transformation and the considerable power it granted him did not go unnoticed or unaddressed by those who understood the threat his new form represented. Among the responses to his communion with Theodorix was the creation of the Serpent-Hunter, a massive greatsword specifically forged and consecrated for the purpose of countering exactly the kind of primordial, serpent-derived power Rykard had chosen to embrace. The existence of this weapon, crafted with such specific purpose, speaks volumes about how seriously Rykard's transformation was taken as an ongoing threat, rather than simply a completed contained act of self-exile. Step back for a moment. The specific timeline separating Rykard's original transformation from whatever eventual completion of the Serpent-Hunter's creation followed it. If considerable time passed between his communion with Theodorix and the weapon's eventual forging and consecration, this suggests the Golden Order, or whatever institution produced the weapon, required time to fully understand and respond to the nature of the threat his transformation actually represented, rather than possessing immediate ready-made countermeasures for exactly this category of danger. This gap, if genuine, implies a period during which Rykard's transformed power existed essentially unchecked, a window of vulnerability for the Borderlands between that only closed once sufficient understanding and resources had been marshalled to produce an effective response. The Serpent-Hunter's design and purpose revealed something important about the broader relationship between the Golden Order and the older primordial forces it had spent generations suppressing or absorbing into its own theological framework. Weapons specifically built to counter serpent-derived power suggest this was not the first time such power had posed a meaningful threat to the established order, that some institutional memory or preparation already existed for exactly this category of danger, even before Rykard's own specific transformation made that preparation newly, urgently relevant. The same pattern shows up elsewhere. What this pattern of pre-existing preparation might reveal regarding the Golden Order's actual historical relationship with primordial serpentine power, beyond the specific threat Rykard's transformation eventually posed. If purpose-built countermeasures already existed in some form before his own communion with Theodorix, this suggests the Golden Order's rise to dominance may have itself involved earlier conflicts or negotiations with these older forces, conflicts whose specific details have been lost or deliberately obscured from the more commonly known official history, but whose lingering institutional caution persisted in the form of weapons and knowledge maintained across generations for exactly this contingency. Something else lingers here: what it means for a demigod, someone who by birthright should have stood among the most protected and powerful figures in the entire lands between, to become someone against whom a purpose-built weapon needed to be specifically prepared and maintained. This detail reframes Rykard's story once again, emphasizing just how materially dangerous his transformation made him, not simply symbolically threatening to the Golden Order's authority, but physically capable of violence and destruction, significant enough to warrant this kind of dedicated, specialized countermeasure. The presence of this weapon within Volcano Manor's own grounds, available to those who eventually make their way deep enough into Rykard's domain to face him directly, also carries a certain grim irony worth noting. The instrument specifically designed to end Rykard's transformed existence rests, in a sense, within reach of anyone determined enough to seek him out, suggesting either a kind of confidence on Rykard's part that no visitor would prove capable of using it effectively against him, or perhaps something closer to resignation, an acknowledgement that his transformation, whatever power and freedom it granted him, always carried within it the seeds of an eventual violent confrontation he could not indefinitely postpone or avoid. The craftsmanship and consecration such a weapon would have required, beyond simply its physical construction. A blade meant to counter primordial serpentine power, forged specifically with that purpose in mind, suggests considerable institutional knowledge and, resources dedicated to understanding exactly what kind of threat beings like Theodorix and those who communed with them actually represented. This level of preparedness implies that Rykard's transformation, however personally motivated, was understood by those responsible for maintaining order in the lands between as part of a broader, recurring category of danger, one significant enough to warrant permanent, purpose-built countermeasures rather than simply an improvised response assembled after the fact. Consider too the peculiar fact that this weapon, forged specifically to end Rykard's existence, was somehow made available within his own domain, discoverable by anyone determined enough to explore Volcano Manor's grounds thoroughly. This detail invites a range of possible interpretations, none of which the surviving records definitively confirm. Perhaps the weapon predates Rykard's own claim to the manor, a relic from some earlier conflict involving different serpentine threats that simply happened to remain in place after he took control of the grounds. Perhaps its presence reflects a kind of dark irony Rykard himself appreciated, keeping the instrument of his potential undoing close at hand as a constant private reminder of the stakes his transformation carried. Or perhaps, as some interpretations suggest, its accessibility says less about Rykard's own intentions and more about the simple, practical difficulty of fully securing every corner of so vast and volcanic a domain against a sufficiently determined and resourceful visitor. One detail stands out: the broader symbolic weight carried by a serpent-slaying weapon specifically, beyond its narrow practical function within Rykard's story. Weapons designed to counter serpentine or draconic threats appear throughout many mythological traditions, often carrying associations with heroic confrontation against primal, chaotic forces that threaten established order. The Serpent-Hunter's presence within this story, then, taps into older narrative patterns than simply Rykard's specific circumstances, positioning whichever Tarnished eventually wields it against him within a much longer tradition of figures who take up specially prepared weapons to confront exactly the kind of primordial, order-threatening power that Rykard's transformation in the end came to represent. This connects to something larger, what the weapon's specific design and craftsmanship might reveal about the distinct tradition or institution responsible for its creation. A great sword built with sufficient size and weight to meaningfully threaten a being of Rykard's transformed scale required considerable smithing expertise, materials capable of withstanding forces most conventional weapons could never survive, and quite possibly consecration or enchantment beyond simple physical construction alone. Whether this weapon emerged from official Golden Order workshops, dedicated specifically to producing countermeasures against exactly this category of threat, or from some more independent tradition of craftsmen specializing in confronting primordial dangers regardless of their relationship to any religious authority, remains another one of the many details Rykard's story leaves productively ambiguous, inviting speculation rather than offering definitive answers. Following his transformation, Rykard's presence within Volcano Manor became increasingly withdrawn, confined to the manor's deepest, most inaccessible chambers, rather than the warmly lit halls where Tanith and other intermediaries conducted the manor's more visible day-to-day business. This physical isolation mirrors something significant about his broader situation following communion with the Serpent, a demigod who had sacrificed his original form to escape the Golden Order's authority, only to find himself confined in a different, though self-chosen, kind of exile deep within his own domain. Take how this pattern of retreat into increasing isolation reflects a broader tendency observable among other figures throughout the lands between who undergo similarly extreme transformations in pursuit of power or freedom from established authority. Transformation of this magnitude, whatever specific power or liberation it grants, appears to consistently carry with it a corresponding cost in terms of ordinary social connection and accessibility, as though the lands between itself operates according to some underlying principle that power gained through means this extreme cannot coexist comfortably with continued unmediated participation in ordinary community and relationship. Rykard's story, viewed alongside these broader patterns, becomes less an isolated aberration and more a particularly clear illustration of a cost that seems to attach itself, in varying degrees, to nearly every act of extreme transformation this world's mythology records. This isolation deserves careful consideration, because it complicates any simple reading of Rykard's transformation as a straightforward triumph or liberation. Whatever power and freedom from mortality he gained through communion with Theodorix, that same transformation seems to have simultaneously rendered him increasingly unable to move freely through the world he once, at least in some limited sense, still participated in as master of Volcano Manor's more visible operations. His new form, monstrous by the Golden Order's standards and likely really difficult for even his own followers to comfortably encounter directly, necessitated a retreat into isolation that echoes, in an uncomfortable way, the very confinement and rejection the Golden Order had originally subjected him to through his exile. There's another layer worth naming: how this echo, isolation following isolation, exile following exile, might have felt from Rykard's own internal perspective, assuming he retained enough of his original consciousness and self-awareness to reflect on his circumstances in this way, recognizing that one supposedly liberating transformation has simply produced a new variation on the same fundamental confinement one originally sought to escape represents a notable kind of bitter, recursive tragedy, the sense of having run an enormous distance only to discover oneself standing, in some essential sense, right back where the journey originally began. There is something worth sitting with in this pattern. A demigod who rejected the Golden Order's authority precisely because he refused to accept the constraints and comforting fictions it imposed on him, finding himself confined once again, this time not by his mother's judgment, but by the practical, physical consequences of his own extreme choice to escape that judgment. Freedom purchased through total transformation, it turns out, came with its own considerable constraints, a new kind of isolation replacing the old one rather than eliminating isolation from his life entirely. This point deserves its own space. What this extended isolation must have done to whatever remained of Rykard's original personality and perspective over time. Years, quite possibly decades, spent largely alone in the Manor's depths, communicating primarily through intermediaries like Tanith, rather than through direct personal interaction, likely reinforced rather than softened the combination of bitterness, conviction, and increasingly detached cruelty that seems to characterize his eventual character by the time a Tarnished finally makes their way deep enough into the Manor to encounter him directly. Isolation, sustained long enough, tends to calcify whatever tendencies already existed rather than naturally resolving or softening them, and Rykard's extended confinement within his own transformed domain appears to follow exactly this pattern. There's a specific quality worth acknowledging in how those who do eventually encounter Rykard directly, deep within the Manor's inner sanctum, describe or experience him, accounts that suggest someone who has grown truly detached from ordinary concern for those around him, finding a kind of grim amusement or satisfaction in the suffering of others that feels less like calculated cruelty and more like the natural byproduct of too many years spent without meaningful connection to anyone who might have challenged or moderated his darker impulses. This detail matters because it suggests that whatever genuine philosophical conviction originally drove Rykard's rebellion against the Golden Order has, by the time of his final confrontation, become entangled with something notably less noble, a kind of casual sadism that seems to have grown alongside his isolation rather than despite it. Consider, too, the loneliness of being feared by one's own followers, even as those followers continue to serve and depend on the Manor's operations for their own survival and belonging. Tanith and the other Recusants who populate Volcano Manor's more visible spaces likely maintain a careful, respectful distance from Rykard's actual presence, treating him less as a personal lord to be visited and consulted, and more as a distant, almost mythic authority whose will is communicated and interpreted through intermediaries rather than experienced directly. This arrangement, whatever practical benefits it offers in terms of maintaining the Manor's operations smoothly, likely compounds Rykard's isolation rather than relieving it, surrounding him with followers who serve his interests while remaining, in any meaningful personal sense, as distant from him as the Golden Order he originally rejected. Notice, too, how Rykard's specific transformation may have physically constrained his ability to move through and interact with the Manor's more populated spaces, even if he had wanted to, beyond simply the psychological or social dimensions of his isolation. A being fused with a creature of Theodorix's scale likely could not comfortably occupy the same warmly furnished halls where Tanith conducts her hospitality, forcing a physical separation between Rykard's transformed form and the rest of the Manor's operations that may have begun as simple practical necessity before eventually calcifying into the deeper, more psychologically significant isolation that came to define his later existence. In this sense, his isolation was never purely a matter of choice, but rather an inevitable consequence of the very transformation he had actively chosen to undergo. This says something about how this enforced physical separation might have shaped the specific character of whatever remained of Rykard's relationship with Tanith and his other closest followers over time. Communication conducted primarily through intermediaries, without the correcting influence of regular direct contact, tends to drift gradually away from accuracy, each party constructing an increasingly abstracted, simplified understanding of the other, based on second-hand reports rather than lived ongoing relationship. Whatever genuine loyalty or connection existed between Rykard and those who served him most closely likely persisted throughout this period of isolation, but almost certainly in an increasingly attenuated, formalized form, more resembling reverent service to a distant authority than anything resembling the more immediate personal relationships he may have maintained earlier in his life, before exile and transformation reshaped every aspect of how he related to those around him. One more thread deserves attention here. What distinct comforts or occupations, if any, Rykard found for himself during these long years of isolation within the Manor's depths. A being of his transformed nature and considerable accumulated bitterness likely did not simply sit passively awaiting eventual confrontation. He may have continued refining the Manor's operations from a distance, receiving reports and issuing instructions through Tanith regarding which targets to pursue next, which Recusants showed promise, which political developments throughout the lands between might present new opportunities for the kind of patient, indirect retaliation his operation specialized in. This ongoing engagement, even from isolation, suggests someone who never fully surrendered to passive despair, maintaining instead a kind of grim, purposeful activity even while cut off from more direct forms of human connection and interaction. Eventually, any Tarnished pursuing the path toward becoming Elden Lord must confront Rykard directly, making their way through Volcano Manor's depths, past the Recusants and their various trials, down into the chamber where Rykard, fused with the great Wyrm's serpentine form, finally waits. This confrontation represents the culmination of everything his story has been building toward: the philosophical rejection, the transformation, the isolation, all of it converging in a single, violent encounter with someone determined to see the Golden Order's fractured legacy through to whatever conclusion the shattering finally demands. There's one final observation worth making about this confrontation before we move toward the story's close. Whatever a given Tarnished's own personal motivations for pursuing the Elden Ring, whether genuine conviction, simple ambition, or something closer to obligation accepted without full understanding of its implications, the act of facing Rykard specifically requires a kind of engagement with philosophical stakes that many other encounters throughout the lands between do not demand quite so directly. Few other figures articulate their opposition to the established order with quite the same clarity and totality Rykard's own story provides, making this notable confrontation among the many a Tarnished must eventually face one of the more thought-provoking rather than simply physically demanding trials along the entire path toward becoming Elden Lord. Something else deserves attention. The emotional register a Tarnished might carry into this confrontation, having spent considerable time within the Manor's warm, hospitable halls before finally descending toward Rykard's actual presence. The gradual accumulation of small, unsettling details, the growing awareness that the Manor's hospitality conceals something darker underneath, likely builds a specific kind of dread well before the actual confrontation begins, distinct from the more sudden, immediate danger many other encounters throughout the lands between present. This slow-building tension, characteristic of Volcano Manor's overall design and atmosphere, ensures that by the time a Tarnished finally stands before Rykard's transformed form, the confrontation feels less like a surprise and more like the inevitable, dreaded culmination of everything the Manor's careful atmosphere has been quietly signalling from the very beginning. The confrontation itself, beyond its immediate physical stakes, carries considerable symbolic weight worth acknowledging. Rykard represents, in this final encounter, the most extreme possible rejection of everything the Golden Order, and the concept of grace traditionally represented within the lands between's broader mythology. Facing him means facing in physical and immediate form the question his entire philosophy was built around, whether genuine freedom from death and from institutional authority over mortality is actually achievable, and if so, whether the cost of achieving it, total transformation into something monstrous and isolated, represents a price worth paying. What happens to Rykard upon defeat carries its own irony given everything his transformation was meant to achieve. Having sacrificed his original form specifically to escape the Golden Order's authority over death, to claim some alternative relationship to mortality entirely outside its sanctioned mechanisms, his eventual defeat at the hands of a determined Tarnished suggests that even this radical alternative path eventually proved unable to grant the total freedom from ending that he had originally sought. Whatever power the Serpent's communion granted him, it apparently did not grant true immortality in the absolute sense he may have originally hoped for when he first sought out Theodorix. There's also how a Tarnished, having actually defeated Rykard and witnessed the specific manner of his final ending, might carry that experience forward into their own subsequent understanding of what the Elden Ring and the status of Elden Lord actually represent. Having watched one demigod's radical attempt to escape mortality entirely fail, a thoughtful Tarnished might reasonably begin questioning whether their own pursuit of the Elden Ring, itself bound up with questions of ultimate authority over life, death, and cosmic order, risks leading towards similarly unresolvable contradictions. Rykard's defeat in this sense functions as more than simply removing an obstacle from the Tarnished's path. It offers a cautionary data point regarding the genuine limits of power, however that power is pursued or through whatever means it is in the end claimed. There's a final irony worth naming. one that echoes throughout much of Elden Ring's broader mythology regarding the various attempts by different figures to escape or subvert established systems of power and mortality. Rykard's entire philosophical project was built around the conviction that the Golden Order's promise regarding death was fundamentally dishonest, and his own extreme response was to seek an alternative entirely outside that system. And yet his eventual defeat, whatever specific narrative or mechanical logic underlies it, suggests that no path pursued within the lands between, however radical or extreme, escapes the reality of ending entirely. Perhaps the story's deeper suggestion is not that Rykard was wrong to question the Golden Order's promises, but that no promise, golden or serpentine, finally delivers the total escape from mortality that both systems, in their own competing ways, claim to offer. This possibility deserves distinct emphasis as we near the end of his story, because it reframes his entire arc away from simple failure or vindication and towards something more honestly ambiguous, a demigod who correctly identified a real flaw in his mother's theology, pursued a reasonable if extreme alternative, and discovered, at the cost of nearly everything he once was, that the underlying problem may have been far larger and more fundamental than either the Golden Order or the primordial serpents alone could ever fully resolve. There is also something worth dwelling on regarding the specific experience of the Tarnished who actually undertakes this confrontation, descending through Volcano Manor's warmly lit upper halls into the colder, stranger depths where Rykard's transformed body waits. This journey itself mirrors, in miniature, the broader arc of Rykard's own story, moving from surface hospitality into buried, uncomfortable truth, from the performance of welcome into the reality of what that welcome has always been concealing. By the time a Tarnished actually stands before Rykard's fused serpentine form, they have already travelled through the physical manifestation of everything his story represents, making the eventual confrontation feel less like a sudden encounter with a stranger, and more like the inevitable culmination of everything the manor's architecture and atmosphere have been quietly signalling from the very first warmly lit hall. Consider too what Rykard's final words or final demeanour, insofar as such details can be gleaned from the encounter, suggest about how he understood this eventual confrontation before it occurred. Rather than desperate resistance or denial, accounts of this final battle tend to emphasise something closer to grim inevitability, almost welcome on Rykard's part, as though he had long understood that his transformation, however much freedom it granted him from the Golden Order's authority, could never fully escape the basic reality that anyone determined and capable enough would eventually reach him, wielding a weapon built specifically for this exact purpose. In this sense, his defeat becomes not simply an external event imposed upon him, but something closer to the final, logical conclusion of a story he himself set into motion, the moment he chose communion with Theodorix over continued submission to his mother's authority. Here's the deeper question. The physical spectacle of this confrontation, distinct from its symbolic or philosophical weight, facing a being of Rykard's transformed scale, fused with a primordial serpent's overwhelming physical presence, represents a substantially different kind of challenge than confronting most other figures within the lands between, even other demigods. The sheer scale involved forces any Tarnished attempting this confrontation to engage with the fight on Rykard's own terms, within an arena and against a form specifically shaped by his notable choice to abandon conventional demigod power in favour of something rawer, more primal, and harder to predict or counter using conventional combat approaches alone. This also reframes how this confrontation, viewed from a slightly wider angle, fits into the broader pattern of trials a Tarnished must overcome throughout their pursuit of the Elden Ring and the status of Elden Lord. Each demigod encountered along this path represents not simply an obstacle to be defeated, but a distinct philosophical position regarding power, legitimacy, and the proper relationship between mortal ambition and divine authority. Rykard's position, argued through the very existence of his transformed body and the manner he built around it, insists that legitimate power need not derive from the Golden Order's sanctioned channels at all. That raw, primal strength claimed through direct communion with older forces represents just as valid a path to significance as anything the Erdtree's grace traditionally offered. Defeating him then carries meaning beyond simply removing an obstacle, representing instead a kind of implicit judgment on this specific philosophical challenge to established order. Take a broader view. What this confrontation might mean specifically for a Tarnished who has, by this point in their own journey, likely already witnessed or heard tell of numerous other demigods' own tragedies and philosophical positions scattered throughout the lands between. Rykard's story, encountered alongside these others, becomes part of a larger cumulative education in the varied and often devastating consequences that flow from the Golden Order's fracturing authority. A Tarnished who has already witnessed Godwyn's fate, Morgoth's burden, or Mark's secretive ambition, arrives at Rykard's confrontation carrying that accumulated context, understanding on some level that whatever they find waiting in the manor's depths represents one more variation on the same underlying crisis of faith and legitimacy that has been quietly unravelling this world since long before their own arrival within it. By the time Rykard's story reaches its conclusion, whatever that conclusion specifically looks like for a given Tarnished's distinct journey through the lands between, he stands as one of the more tragic figures among Marika's demigod children, not because his rebellion against the Golden Order was unjustified, but because the path he chose in pursuing that rebellion cost him nearly everything recognizably himself along the way, without delivering the total freedom from death and institutional control that originally motivated his transformation. What makes a story like Rykard's really worth sitting with at length, rather than simply cataloguing as one more entry among the lands between's many tragic demigod figures? His tale resists easy moral categorization in a way that feels instructive, refusing to offer either straightforward villainy or straightforward heroism as a comfortable resting point. He was a rebel whose rebellion contained genuine philosophical merit, a victim of institutional betrayal who became, through his own choices, someone who inflicted considerable harm on others in turn. A demigod who purchased freedom at a cost so total, it's truly unclear whether what remained afterward could still meaningfully be called freedom at all. Stories that resist this kind of easy resolution, that insist on holding multiple, uncomfortable truths simultaneously rather than collapsing into simple judgment, tend to be the ones that linger longest, precisely because they mirror something true about how complicated most real questions of rebellion, authority, and personal cost actually turn out to be. What lingers most significantly about Rykard's story, considered alongside the broader mythology of the lands between's shattering, is the genuine philosophical challenge his rejection poses to the Golden Order's authority, a challenge the story never fully resolves in either direction. He was not simply wrong to doubt his mother's promises regarding death and grace. His siblings' own fates, scattered across various forms of suffering, corruption, and eventual death despite their continued faith and loyalty to the Golden Order, suggest that Rykard's underlying skepticism about the actual value and honesty of Marika's promises was not entirely unfounded, and yet his own chosen alternative, communion with primordial serpentine power, eventually proved equally unable to deliver genuine escape from ending, suggesting that the deeper problem may not have been the Golden Order specifically, but something more fundamental about the nature of power, mortality, and the promises any system, divine or otherwise, makes about transcending them. Rykard's place among the demigods, viewed through this lens, becomes less a simple story of villainy or monstrous transformation, and more a genuine exploration of what happens when someone refuses to accept comforting fictions without demanding they be tested against reality, even when testing them requires sacrifices as total and irreversible as the one Rykard made. His story sits uncomfortably, deliberately so, between sympathy and horror, between genuine philosophical courage and genuine, undeniable cruelty toward those his transformation and subsequent operations at Volcano Manor in the end harmed along the way. Looking at Rykard's story within the wider context of the shattering and the broader collapse of the Golden Order's authority throughout the lands between, his rebellion represents one of several different responses demigods made to the same underlying crisis of faith and legitimacy that eventually fractured their mother's entire golden vision. Where Morgoth chose duty despite doubt, where Mog pursued dark ambition largely in secret, Rykard chose total, visible, irreversible rejection, transforming himself into living proof that the Golden Order's promises could be refused, however costly that refusal proved to be for the one who dared to make it. Rykard's story also fits into the broader pattern of what happens to those who reject established religious and political authority in favour of older, more primal alternatives throughout the Lands Between's history. He is not the only figure to seek power outside the Golden Order's sanctioned channels, nor the only one to pay a considerable personal cost for doing so. But his story stands out for the sheer totality of his commitment, the way he did not simply flirt with alternative sources of power while hedging his bets, but instead committed himself entirely and irreversibly to a path that offered no possibility of return to his original form or standing, regardless of how that path finally concluded. It's worth pausing on what makes his particular brand of commitment so rare among the many demigods and lesser figures scattered throughout the Lands Between, who might reasonably have shared some version of his underlying doubts. Doubt alone is common. Acting on doubt in small, reversible ways is somewhat rarer but still not unheard of. What Rykard did, burning every bridge back to his original identity in a single irreversible act, belongs to a much smaller category of response, one that trades every possible future for the certainty of a single chosen path. Few figures throughout this world's history commit to anything with quite that degree of finality, which is part of why his story continues to draw attention long after more cautious rebellions have faded from memory. It's worth reflecting finally on what Rykard's story suggests about the broader nature of rebellion itself, particularly rebellion against systems that claim divine or absolute authority over fundamental questions like mortality and meaning. Genuine rebellion, his story seems to suggest, rarely offers clean, uncomplicated victory. It demands sacrifice, often total and irreversible sacrifice, and even when it succeeds in escaping the specific authority being rejected, it may simply deliver the rebel into a different, equally inescapable set of constraints, whether physical isolation, monstrous transformation, or the same basic mortality. The entire rebellion was originally organised around escaping. Rykard's story, in this sense, offers no comfortable answer about whether his rebellion was worth its cost. It simply insists that the question be taken seriously, that his doubt about the Golden Order's promises be treated as reasonable, even while acknowledging the genuine horror of what he eventually became in pursuing an answer to that doubt. There's a final thread worth pulling on before we close this story out completely, one concerning how Rykard's tale sits alongside the stories of his siblings within the larger tapestry of the shattering. Each of Marika's demigod children, in their own way, represents a different possible response to the same underlying crisis, the slow, inevitable erosion of the Golden Order's claim to absolute, unquestionable authority over life, death, and meaning within the lands between. Godwyn's story is one of betrayal and premature ending. Morgott's is one of quiet, burdened duty maintained despite deep personal cost. Murgh's is one of secretive, patient ambition, pursued largely outside official channels. Rykard's story stands apart from all of these by virtue of its totality and its visibility. He did not simply doubt quietly, or scheme secretly, or suffer duty's weight without complaint. He rejected everything, publicly, completely, and paid the full price that total rejection demanded, becoming in the process a living argument against the very system that raised him, an argument the Golden Order could neither successfully refute nor fully silence, right up until the moment a determined Tarnished finally brought his long isolated rebellion to its inevitable, violent close. There's one more dimension of Rykard's legacy before we let this story rest for the night, one concerning how his specific choices continue to echo through Volcano Manor's ongoing operations even after his eventual defeat. The Recusants who served him, the assassination network Tanith helped maintain, the entire economy of hired violence built around his exile and grievance, none of this simply vanishes the moment a Tarnished finally reaches the Manor's depths and ends his transformed existence. Whatever structures Rykard built during his long years of exile and isolation likely persist, at least for some time, as institutional momentum carries forward what his personal will originally set into motion. A reminder that, even after an individual's story concludes, the systems and relationships they constructed during their lifetime rarely disappear quite so neatly or completely alongside them. One loose thread worth leaving open: what specifically happens to Tanith and the remaining Recusants once the figure their entire operation was organised around has finally been defeated? Do they scatter, their shared purpose dissolved along with the Lord who gave it structure? Do they attempt to maintain the Manor's operations independently, perhaps under Tanith's own leadership, continuing to offer contracts and shelter to future Recusants regardless of Rykard's absence? Or does the Manor itself gradually fall into disrepair, its warm hospitality slowly fading as the underlying purpose that once animated it disappears along with its transformed master? The story leaves this question unanswered, another loose thread among the many that make Rykard's tale resist the kind of clean, complete resolution more conventional stories typically provide. And so we arrive finally at the quiet end of Rykard's long, smouldering rebellion, a demigod who looked at the golden promises surrounding him from birth, found them wanting, and spent the remainder of his existence proving, at whatever cost, that his doubt had been justified all along, even if the alternative he in the end chose proved just as unable to deliver total escape from ending as the system he originally rejected. Perhaps that is the quietest, truest lesson buried within his entire story, that rebellion against comforting fiction rarely delivers a more comfortable truth in its place, only a different, equally difficult reckoning with the same fundamental limits. Every living thing, golden or serpentine, demigod or mortal, shares. It is worth carrying that thought gently, rather than as a grim conclusion into whatever rest tonight offers you. If you've made it this far tonight, thank you for sitting with a story that resists easy resolution the way Rykard's honestly does. Before you drift off completely, if this journey through Volcano Manor's warm halls and cold depths, through exile and transformation, and the distinct loneliness of total rebellion stayed with you, consider leaving a like or subscribing, so more of these deep dives can find their way to you while you sleep. It helps this channel keep doing what it does. And if tonight is the first time you've spent an evening here in Nightfall lore, welcome. There are many more quiet corners of this world, and others like it still waiting to be explored slowly, together, whenever you're ready to return. One last thought before we close the doors on Volcano Manor for tonight. Every story we tell here, whether it concerns a knight, a queen, a hunter, or a demigod who chose to become something monstrous rather than continue serving a lie, finally circles back to the same handful of questions. What do we owe the systems and people who raised us? What does genuine freedom actually cost? And what remains of a person once they've paid that cost in full? Rykard never found comfortable answers to any of these questions, and neither, honestly, does this story. But there is something quietly worthwhile in simply sitting with the questions themselves, turning them over slowly in the dark, the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your palm without needing to arrive anywhere fixed with it. Let the questions rest now, alongside everything else the day asked of you. It's fair to ask whether stories like Rykard's serve a real purpose for those who spend their nights listening to them, beyond simple entertainment or curiosity about a beloved game's deeper mythology. There is something quietly clarifying about sitting with a character who asks difficult questions about authority, mortality, and belonging. Questions that, translated loosely out of their fantastical context, resemble questions many people carry privately into their own ordinary lives. We're not often asked to commune with primordial serpents or reject golden empires outright, but we are, most of us, asked at some point to decide how much of an inherited belief, an inherited role, or an inherited expectation we are willing to accept without question, and how much we are willing to risk in order to test it honestly against our own lived experience of the world. Sleep well, good Tarnished.